The wind cut through the concrete canyons of Manhattan like a blade, carrying with it the promise of another brutal February night. Snow fell in heavy, wet flakes that turned to slush the moment they hit the asphalt, creating a gray, unforgiving landscape that mirrored Lily Harper's current state of mind. She pulled her thin coat tighter around her shoulders, the worn fabric doing little to ward off the bitter cold that seemed to seep into her bones. 23 years old, and completely alone in a city of 8 million people. That was Lily's reality. The eviction notice crumpled in her back pocket felt like a weight, heavier than the backpack containing everything she owned. 3 days. That's all the time she had left before losing the tiny studio apartment in Queens that had been her sanctuary for the past 8 months. The part-time job at the local diner barely covered her meals, let alone rent in one of the most expensive cities in the world. As she walked down Fifth Avenue, the contrast between her reality and the world around her couldn't have been more stark. Designer boutiques glowed warmly behind their pristine windows, displaying clothes that cost more than she'd make in 6 months. Well-dressed pedestrians hurried past, their designer coats and confident strides speaking of lives untouched by the kind of desperation that had become Lily's constant companion. She'd grown up in foster care in upstate New York, bouncing between homes where she was either ignored or treated as an unwelcome burden. At 18, she'd aged out of the system with nothing but a high school diploma and an unshakable belief that somewhere out there, life had to offer more than just survival. New York City had called to her like a beacon, promising opportunities and a chance to reinvent herself. 4 years later, that dream felt more like a cruel joke. The snow was falling harder now, and Lily could feel the dampness seeping through her worn sneakers. She'd been walking for hours, trying to stay warm and avoid the reality of another night spent in the 24-hour laundromat or the subway station. Her stomach growled, reminding her that the stale bagel she'd found behind the diner that morning was her only meal of the day. As she turned onto a quieter side street lined with upscale residential buildings, Lily noticed the cars parked along the curb. BMWs, Mercedes, Audis, vehicles that represented more wealth than she'd ever imagined possessing. She wasn't bitter about it exactly, just tired of feeling invisible in a world where money seemed to be the only currency that mattered. That's when she saw it, a sleek black Tesla Model S parked under a streetlight, its chrome accents gleaming despite the falling snow. What caught her attention wasn't just the car's obvious luxury, but the fact that it seemed to be unlocked. The driver's side door sat slightly ajar, as if someone had gotten out in a hurry and forgotten to secure it properly. Lily hesitated, looking around the empty street. The building next to the car was clearly expensive, one of those pre-war structures that had been converted into luxury condos, complete with a doorman who was currently nowhere to be seen. She glanced at her phone. 11:47 p.m. The temperature had dropped to 22 degrees, and the wind was picking up. Just for a few minutes, she told herself. Just until the worst of the snow passes. She approached the car cautiously, her heart hammering against her ribs. The interior was even more impressive than the exterior. Cream leather seats, a massive touchscreen display, and that new car smell that spoke of money and comfort. The moment she slipped inside and pulled the door closed, the difference was immediate. The wind stopped howling in her ears, and the residual heat from the car's climate control system began to thaw her frozen fingers. Lily sank back into the driver's seat, feeling the exhaustion of the day settle into her bones. The leather was so soft, so different from the hard plastic chairs at the diner or the lumpy mattress in her soon-to-be former apartment. For the first time in months, she felt safe, even if it was just an illusion. She closed her eyes, telling herself she'd stay just until she warmed up, just until she could figure out her next move. The stress of the past weeks caught up with her all at once. The unpaid bills, the job interviews that led nowhere, the constant fear of ending up on the streets. Despite her best efforts to stay alert, the warmth and comfort of the car began to lull her towards sleep. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the city in a deceptive layer of purity that would be gone by morning, trampled underfoot, and mixed with the grime of urban life. But inside the Tesla, Lily felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Peace. She was so lost in that feeling that she didn't hear the footsteps approaching on the sidewalk, or see the tall figure in an expensive overcoat walking toward the car with purposeful strides. Alexander Reed had just finished a business dinner that had run later than expected, discussing a potential acquisition that could add another $50 million to his portfolio. His mind was still processing the details of the deal when he noticed his car door was ajar. His first instinct was irritation. Had his driver been careless? But Marcus had gone home hours ago, and Alexander had driven himself to dinner. As he got closer, he could see a small figure curled up in the driver's seat, and his irritation quickly shifted to confusion, then concern. Alexander approached slowly, his business instincts warring with something else, a curiosity about this person who had sought refuge in his car. Through the window, he could see it was a young woman, probably in her early 20s, with dark hair that had escaped from a ponytail and clothes that had clearly seen better days. She was shivering even in sleep, and there was something about her face, peaceful despite the obvious signs of exhaustion, that made him pause. He could have called the police. Should have, according to every logical part of his brain. This was trespassing, after all, and Alexander Reed was not a man who tolerated chaos in his carefully ordered world. At 31, he had built a real estate empire through discipline, control, and an unwavering focus on the bottom line. Emotions were liabilities, complications that had no place in business or, by extension, his life. But something about this moment felt different. Maybe it was the vulnerability of the scene before him, or the way the falling snow created a bubble of intimacy around the car. Maybe it was the memory of his own childhood loneliness, buried so deep he rarely acknowledged it existed. Whatever it was, Alexander found himself reaching for the passenger door instead of his phone. The sound of the door opening woke Lily instantly. Her eyes flew open, wide with panic, as she took in the tall, imposing figure settling into the seat beside her. In the dim light, she could see sharp cheekbones, dark hair perfectly styled despite the weather, and eyes that seemed to assess everything they saw. This was clearly the car's owner, and clearly someone who didn't belong in the same world as her. "I'm sorry," she said quickly, already reaching for the door handle. "I'm so sorry. It was cold, and I thought—" "Stop," Alexander said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of authority that came from years of boardroom negotiations. "You're shivering." Lily froze, uncertain whether this was kindness or a prelude to something worse. In her experience, when men with money and power found women in vulnerable positions, the outcomes were rarely good. But there was something in his tone that didn't match the predatory behavior she'd learned to fear. "I'll leave," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I didn't mean to—" "When's the last time you ate?" Alexander asked, cutting her off again. The question surprised them both. He hadn't planned to ask it, and she clearly hadn't expected it. Lily stared at him, trying to read his intentions. Up close, she could see that his expensive suit was perfectly tailored. His watch probably cost more than most people made in a year, and everything about him screamed success and control. But his eyes held something she hadn't expected. Not pity exactly, but a kind of recognition that made her chest tighten. "Yesterday," she admitted finally, the truth slipping out before she could stop it. Alexander nodded slowly, as if confirming something he'd already suspected. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his phone, fingers moving efficiently across the screen. Lily watched him, still poised to run, but growing more curious by the moment about this man, who hadn't immediately called the police or thrown her out into the storm. "What's your name?" he asked without looking up from his phone. "Lily," she said, then immediately wondered if she should have lied. "Lily," he repeated as if testing how it sounded. "I'm Alexander, and I think we need to talk." The 24-hour diner on the corner of Lexington and 47th wasn't the kind of place Alexander Reed typically frequented, with its cracked vinyl booths, flickering fluorescent lights, and the perpetual smell of coffee that had been sitting too long on the burner. It was about as far from his usual haunts as possible. But it was warm, it was open, and most importantly, it was the kind of place where a conversation like the one he was about to have wouldn't draw unwanted attention. Lily sat across from him in the booth, her hands wrapped around a mug of hot chocolate she'd barely touched. She'd ordered it because it was the cheapest thing on the menu, but Alexander had insisted she get something substantial to eat as well. The burger and fries in front of her remained largely untouched, not because she wasn't hungry, but because the surreal nature of the situation had stolen her appetite. An hour ago, she'd been sleeping in a stranger's car, preparing for another night of survival on the streets of New York. Now she was sitting across from that stranger, a man whose watch probably cost more than she'd made in the last 6 months, trying to understand why he was being kind to her instead of having her arrested. "You're not eating," Alexander observed, his own coffee sitting untouched in front of him. He'd ordered it out of habit more than desire. His mind was too busy processing the evening's unexpected turn to focus on caffeine. "I'm still trying to figure out if this is real," Lily admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. The diner's harsh lighting revealed details that the dim interior of the car had hidden. The sharp angles of Alexander's face, the way his suit fit him perfectly despite the late hour, the calluses on his hands that suggested he hadn't always lived a life of luxury. Alexander leaned back against the worn vinyl, studying her with the same intensity he brought to business negotiations. But this wasn't business, and he was finding that his usual analytical approach felt inadequate for the situation at hand. "Tell me about yourself," he said finally. Lily let out a bitter laugh. "What's to tell? I'm a walking cliché. Poor girl from nowhere tries to make it in the big city, fails spectacularly. Not exactly the kind of story that makes for interesting dinner conversation in your circles, I'm guessing." "My circles," Alexander repeated slowly, "aren't as interesting as you might think." There was something in his tone that made Lily look up from her hot chocolate. For just a moment, she saw past the expensive clothes and commanding presence to something else. Loneliness, maybe, or a weariness that money couldn't cure. "I grew up in foster care," she found herself saying, surprising them both with her honesty. "Aged out at 18 with nothing but a belief that if I could just get to New York, everything would be different. Turns out the city doesn't care about your dreams if you don't have the connections or the capital to make them happen." Alexander nodded slowly. He understood about dreams that required capital. His entire life had been built on that principle. But he also understood something about loneliness, about growing up without the kind of support most people took for granted. "My parents died when I was 12, he said quietly, the words coming out before he could stop them. He never talked about his childhood, especially not with strangers in all-night diners. But something about Lily's unguarded honesty seemed to demand the same in return. "Car accident. I went to live with my uncle, my father's brother. He was successful, very focused on achievement, on building something that would last. He taught me that emotions were weakness, that the only security in life came from power and money." Lily watched his face as he spoke, noticing the way his jaw tightened slightly, the careful control in his voice. "Sounds lonely," she said softly. Alexander met her eyes, startled by her directness. Most people, especially women, approached him with calculation, weighing his wealth against his availability, his influence against their own ambitions. But Lily was looking at him like he was just a person, and he couldn't remember the last time that had happened. "It was practical," he said, but the words felt hollow even to him. "Practical and lonely aren't mutually exclusive," Lily pointed out, then immediately looked away, as if surprised by her own boldness. They sat in silence for a moment, the sounds of the diner filling the space between them, the sizzle of the grill, the clink of dishes, the low murmur of other late-night patrons seeking warmth and sustenance. Outside, the snow continued to fall, transforming the city into something softer, more forgiving than its daytime reality. "Why didn't you call the police?" Lily asked suddenly. Alexander considered the question, trying to understand his own motivations. "I don't know," he said finally. and the admission felt more honest than anything he'd said in months. Maybe because you reminded me of something I'd forgotten. What's that? What it feels like to need help. The simple statement hung between them, carrying more weight than either had expected. Lily felt something shift inside her chest. Not gratitude exactly, but recognition. Here was someone who understood what it meant to be fundamentally alone, even if their circumstances were completely different. "I have a proposition," Alexander said, his business instincts finally reasserting themselves. "You need a place to stay, and I could use some help." Lily's walls immediately went up. She'd heard propositions before, usually from men who saw her desperation as an opportunity. "What kind of help?" Alexander caught the change in her tone, the way her shoulders tensed. "Not what you're thinking," he said quickly. "I travel frequently for business, and my penthouse apartment needs someone to manage things, collect mail, coordinate with cleaning services, basic maintenance issues. It's legitimate work, and it comes with a guest room." "Why me?" Lily asked, suspicion still evident in her voice. "You don't know anything about me. I could be anyone." "Because?" Alexander said, meeting her gaze steadily. "Sometimes the best decisions aren't the practical ones." Lily stared at him, trying to read between the lines. The offer sounded too good to be true, which in her experience meant it probably was. But the alternative was 3 more days until eviction, followed by, what? Shelters with waiting lists, streets that grew more dangerous by the day, the slow erosion of whatever dignity she had left. "I'm not a charity case," she said firmly. "I'm not offering charity," Alexander replied. "I'm offering employment. There's a difference. What makes you think I won't just rob you blind and disappear?" Alexander smiled for the first time since they'd met, and the expression transformed his entire face. "Because if you were going to steal from me, you would have taken my car instead of sleeping in it." Despite herself, Lily felt her lips quirk upward. "That's assuming I know how to drive a Tesla. Do you? I don't even have a license." This time, Alexander's smile reached his eyes. "Well, that's something we can fix." The conversation continued for another hour, covering practical details and unspoken boundaries. Alexander explained that his penthouse took up the entire top floor of a building in Midtown, that she'd have her own space and her own key, that the job was real and the pay was fair. Lily found herself believing him, partly because she wanted to, but mostly because there was something in his manner that suggested he was as surprised by the offer as she was. When they finally left the diner, the snow had stopped, and the streets were eerily quiet. Alexander's driver had been called and was waiting with the Tesla, having retrieved it from the street where they'd first met. As they rode through the empty city streets, Lily pressed her face to the window, watching her reflection in the glass, and wondering if she was making the biggest mistake of her life. "1 month, she said suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence. "What?" "Trial period. 1 month. If it doesn't work out for either of us, I walk away. No hard feelings." Alexander considered this, recognizing the protection the boundary offered them both. 1 month, he agreed. As the car pulled up in front of his building, Lily saw the doorman hurry out to open their door, his practiced deference a reminder of the world she was about to enter. The lobby was all marble and gold, the kind of place where her worn clothes and second-hand shoes would mark her as an outsider. But Alexander didn't seem to notice or care about the curious looks from the night staff as he guided her to the private elevator. As they rode up 37 floors, Lily felt her ears pop and wondered if she was ascending to heaven or simply setting herself up for a longer fall. "Welcome home," Alexander said as the elevator doors opened directly into his apartment. Lily stepped out into a space that was more like a museum than a home. Floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the city, modern art on the walls, furniture that looked like it belonged in a design magazine. It was beautiful and cold, and completely unlike anything she'd ever experienced. "The guest room is down that hall," Alexander said, pointing to the left. "Tomorrow we can discuss details, boundaries, expectations. But tonight, you should rest." As Lily walked toward what would be her room, She turned back to find Alexander still standing by the elevator, looking somehow smaller in the vast space of his apartment. "Alexander," she called softly. "Yes, thank you," he nodded, then disappeared down the opposite hallway, leaving Lily alone in a world that felt like it belonged to someone else entirely. 3 weeks into their arrangement, Lily had established a routine that kept her interactions with Alexander to a minimum. She woke early before he left for work, handling correspondence and coordinating service calls while he was safely ensconced in his home office. She grocery shopped in the afternoons, learning his preferences through trial and error. Good coffee, minimal processed food, a peculiar fondness for dark chocolate that he seemed almost embarrassed about. Evenings were hers. He rarely returned before 8, and when he did, he retreated to his study or his bedroom, maintaining the careful distance they'd both agreed was necessary. It was working, this careful dance of avoidance. Lily had her own space, her own purpose, and for the first time in months, she wasn't constantly calculating how many meals she could afford, or whether she'd have a safe place to sleep. Alexander had his efficiency back. No more mail piling up. No more frantic calls from his housekeeper about broken appliances or missed deliveries. They were both getting what they needed while maintaining the boundaries that kept things professional. Which was why Lily was completely unprepared to find Alexander sitting at his kitchen island at 2 o'clock on a Tuesday afternoon, still in his pajamas, staring at his laptop screen with an expression she'd never seen before. "Are you sick?" she asked, setting down the grocery bag she'd just brought up from the lobby. Alexander looked up and she could see that his eyes were red-rimmed with exhaustion. His usually perfect hair was disheveled, and there was a coffee stain on his white t-shirt that suggested he'd been sitting there for a while. "The Morrison deal fell through," he said, his voice flat with the kind of exhaustion that went deeper than physical tiredness. Lily had heard him on enough phone calls to know that the Morrison deal was huge, a commercial development project in Brooklyn that represented months of work and millions of dollars in potential profit. She also knew enough about business to understand that deals fell through all the time and that someone with Alexander's portfolio could probably absorb the loss without significant damage. But looking at him now, she realized this wasn't about money. "I'm sorry," she said carefully, not sure if he wanted sympathy or solitude. Alexander laughed, but there was no humor in it. 18 months of work, hundreds of thousands in development costs, all because I missed one detail in the environmental impact report. He ran his hands through his hair, making it even more disheveled. One detail that any competent developer should have caught. Lily found herself moving closer, her instinct for comfort overriding the professional distance they'd maintained. "Mistakes happen?" she said softly. "Not to me." Alexander replied sharply, then immediately looked apologetic. "I'm sorry. This isn't your problem." But as she watched him struggle with what was clearly more than professional disappointment, Lily realized that it was her problem. Not because of their business arrangement, but because somewhere in the past 3 weeks, she'd started to care about him, as more than just the man providing her with shelter. "When's the last time you ate?" she asked, echoing the question he'd asked her that first night in the car. Alexander glanced at his watch, seeming surprised by the time. "I don't remember." Lily nodded and moved to the refrigerator, pulling out ingredients with the efficiency of someone who'd been managing his household for weeks. "Grilled cheese and tomato soup," she announced. "Comfort food. You don't have to." "I'm making it for me too," she said, which was partially true. "And it's easier to make 2 portions." As she worked, Alexander watched her move around his kitchen with a familiarity that surprised him. When had she learned that he kept the good bread in the freezer? How had she figured out his preference for sharp cheddar over mild? These small intimacies felt more invasive than her presence in his apartment, and yet somehow more comforting too. "Tell me about the deal," Lily said as she buttered the bread. "What happened?" Alexander found himself explaining the complexities of urban development, the web of regulations and environmental assessments that governed commercial construction in New York. Lily listened without judgment, asking questions that showed she was actually paying attention rather than just being polite. "So, the wetlands designation means you can't build there at all?" she asked, sliding a perfectly golden grilled cheese in front of him. "Not without mitigation measures that would cost more than the project is worth," Alexander confirmed, taking a bite. The sandwich was perfect, crispy outside, melted inside, exactly the kind of simple comfort he hadn't realized he needed. "Can you find another site?" "Maybe. Eventually. But this one was perfect. Location, infrastructure, community support. It would have been." He trailed off, realizing how much of himself he was revealing. "It would have been what?" Lily prompted gently. Alexander set down his sandwich, meeting her eyes across the kitchen island. "It would have been something to be proud of. Not just profitable, but actually beneficial. Mixed-use development with affordable housing, green spaces, community resources. The kind of project that makes a neighborhood better instead of just more expensive." Lily heard the passion in his voice, the vision that went beyond mere profit. "That's not the kind of thing I expected you to care about," she said honestly. "Because I'm a ruthless capitalist who only cares about money?" Alexander asked, but his tone was more curious than offended. "Because that's the image you project," Lily replied. "All business, all efficiency. I've been living here for 3 weeks, and this is the first time I've seen you care about anything beyond the bottom line." Alexander considered this, recognizing the truth in her observation. "Caring about things beyond profit is a luxury I couldn't afford when I was building the business," he said finally. "But lately, I've been wondering what the point is if all I'm building is wealth." It was the most honest thing he'd said to anyone in years, and the vulnerability of it made him want to retreat back to his study and the safety of spreadsheets and contracts. But something about the way Lily was looking at him, not with pity or calculation, but with genuine understanding, kept him talking. "My uncle used to say that sentiment was the enemy of success," he continued. "That if you wanted to build something that lasted, you couldn't afford to let emotions cloud your judgment." "And you believed him?" "I had to. He was the only family I had left, and he was successful by any measure. But now..." Alexander paused, struggling to articulate something he'd only recently begun to understand. "Now I'm wondering if he was wrong, or if success without sentiment is just another kind of failure." Lily nodded slowly, recognizing the existential crisis behind his words. "It's hard to know who you really are when you've spent so long being who you think you should be," she said quietly. The insight hit Alexander like a physical blow, partly because it was so accurate, and partly because it was coming from someone who barely knew him. But maybe that was exactly why she could see it. She hadn't known him long enough to be invested in the image he'd spent years constructing. "Is that what happened to you?" he asked. "Being someone you thought you should be?" Lily smiled sadly, recognizing the deflection for what it was but choosing to answer anyway. "I spent so many years trying to be the perfect foster kid, grateful, undemanding, invisible when necessary. I thought if I could just be good enough, someone would want to keep me." She picked at her own sandwich, appetite forgotten. "When I aged out and came to New York, I tried to be the perfect employee, the perfect tenant, the perfect candidate for whatever opportunity might come along. But perfect isn't real, and eventually, real life catches up with you." "And what's real life for you?" Alexander asked, genuinely curious about this woman who'd been living in his space, but remained largely a mystery to him. "I don't know yet," Lily admitted. "I'm still figuring it out, but I know it's not hiding from who I am, because I'm afraid someone won't like what they see." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the afternoon light shifting through the floor-to-ceiling windows as the city continued its relentless pace far below. Alexander found himself studying Lily's face, noticing details he'd missed during their careful weeks of avoidance. The small scar above her left eyebrow, the way she bit her lower lip when she was thinking, the strength in her hands that spoke of physical work and resilience. "I have an idea," he said suddenly, the words coming out before he could second-guess himself. "About what?" "The Morrison site. What if we approached it differently? Instead of trying to maximize profit, what if we focused on maximizing impact? Work with the environmental restrictions instead of against them. Lily's eyes lit up with interest. You mean like a sustainability showcase? Use the wetlands as a feature instead of an obstacle? Exactly. Alexander was already reaching for his laptop, his earlier despair replaced by a familiar energy. Elevated walkways, native plantings, stormwater management that turns into community amenities. Educational components, Lily added, caught up in his enthusiasm. Teaching gardens, nature centers, maybe even research partnerships with local universities. They spent the next 2 hours at the kitchen island, Alexander's laptop between them as they sketched out possibilities. Lily's suggestions came from a different perspective than his usual consultants. She thought about community needs rather than investor returns, about long-term sustainability rather than short-term profit. And Alexander found that her questions challenged his assumptions in ways that made the project better, more innovative, more genuinely impactful. This could actually work, he said finally, leaning back in his chair and looking at the notes they'd compiled. Of course it could work, Lily replied. The question is whether you're brave enough to try it. Alexander looked at her, struck again by her directness. What makes you think I'm not brave? Because brave would have been pursuing this vision from the beginning, instead of defaulting to what you thought would be most profitable. Lily's tone was gentle, but her words carried weight. Brave would be trusting that doing the right thing might actually be good business too. The challenge in her voice sparked something in Alexander that he'd thought was long dead. The part of him that had once dreamed of building things that mattered, not just things that sold. Before his uncle's pragmatism had taught him to bury those dreams beneath spreadsheets and profit margins. You're right, he said simply. I know, Lily replied with a small smile. The question is, what are you going to do about it? Alexander looked at his laptop screen, at the notes they'd made, at the possibility of redemption disguised as a business plan. Then he looked at Lily, this woman who'd been sleeping in his car a month ago and was now challenging him to be better than he'd ever thought possible. I'm going to need help, he said finally. What kind of help? The kind that comes from someone who cares more about doing the right thing than making money. Someone who isn't afraid to tell me when I'm being an idiot. He paused, meeting her eyes. Someone like you. Lily felt her heart skip a beat, understanding that this was more than a job offer. This was Alexander asking her to be a partner, to help him rebuild not just a project, but himself. It was terrifying and exhilarating and completely different from anything she'd ever imagined for her life. What exactly are you asking me? She said carefully. I'm asking you to help me figure out how to build something worth building, Alexander replied. And I'm asking if you want to do it together. The word together hung between them, carrying implications that neither was quite ready to examine. But as Lily looked at Alexander, really looked at him, past the expensive clothes and commanding presence to the man underneath, she realized that somewhere in the past month, their careful professional arrangement had become something else entirely, something that felt dangerously close to hope. The presentation was scheduled for Thursday morning at 10 a.m., exactly 6 weeks after Lily had first sought shelter in Alexander's car. She stood in front of the bathroom mirror in her guest room, adjusting the blazer Alexander had insisted on buying her for the occasion. The deep blue fabric was nicer than anything she'd ever owned, and when she looked at her reflection, she almost didn't recognize the confident woman staring back at her. In the weeks since their kitchen conversation, everything had changed. What had started as a radical reimagining of the Morrison project had evolved into something neither of them had expected, a true partnership. Lily's fresh perspective and genuine passion for community impact had pushed Alexander to think beyond profit margins, while his business acumen and industry connections had given her ideas the framework they needed to become reality. They'd spent countless hours together, working late into the night, debating details over coffee, and gradually building something that felt more significant than either had imagined possible. But somewhere in the process of building a business partnership, they'd also built something else, a connection that had nothing to do with work and everything to do with the people they were becoming when they forgot to maintain their careful boundaries. Alexander was waiting for her in the living room when she emerged, and the way his expression softened when he saw her made her heart skip a beat. He'd given up his usual armor of expensive suits for something slightly less formal, still professional, but with an approachability that reflected the changes the past weeks had brought. "Ready?" he asked, but the question carried more weight than simple preparation for a meeting. "Ready," Lily confirmed, though her nerves suggested otherwise. The car ride to Morrison Industries was quiet, both of them lost in their own thoughts. Lily knew that today's presentation represented more than just a business proposal. It was Alexander's chance to prove to himself that he could build something meaningful, and her chance to prove that her ideas had value beyond good intentions. But it was also something else, a test of whether the partnership they'd built could survive in the real world, beyond the protective bubble of Alexander's apartment. Morrison Industries occupied 3 floors of a glass tower in Midtown, all clean lines and corporate efficiency. As they rode the elevator to the executive conference room, Lily felt the familiar anxiety of being out of place in a world of wealth and power. But when Alexander reached over and squeezed her hand gently, the gesture so quick and natural that she almost missed it, her nerves settled. "You belong here," he said quietly, as if reading her thoughts. The conference room was intimidating, a long mahogany table surrounded by leather chairs, floor-to-ceiling windows, offering a view of the city that seemed designed to remind visitors of the stakes involved. Robert Morrison himself was a man in his 60s with the kind of presence that came from decades of successful deal-making. He was flanked by 2 assistants and his head of development, all of whom looked skeptical about whatever proposal had brought them here on a Thursday morning. "Alexander," Morrison said, rising to shake hands, "I have to admit, I was surprised to hear from you again after our last conversation. Thank you for giving us the opportunity to present," Alexander replied smoothly. "I think you'll find our revised approach addresses your concerns while offering something entirely different from our original proposal." As they settled around the table, Lily caught Morrison's curious glance in her direction. Alexander had introduced her simply as his partner, without elaboration, letting her credentials speak for themselves. It was a small gesture, but one that spoke volumes about how much had changed between them. The presentation began with Alexander outlining the revised concept, a mixed-use development that worked with the environmental constraints rather than against them, incorporating the wetlands as a central feature and community asset. His delivery was confident and professional, but Lily could hear the genuine passion beneath the business language, the excitement of someone presenting an idea he truly believed in. When it was her turn to speak, Lily felt the familiar surge of nerves that came with being the youngest and least formally educated person in the room. But as she began explaining the community engagement strategies and sustainability features they'd developed, her passion for the project overcame her insecurity. She spoke about the educational opportunities, the job creation potential, the way the development could serve as a model for environmentally conscious urban planning. "The initial investment may be higher," she concluded, "but the long-term returns, both financial and social, justify the additional cost. And more importantly, you'll be building something that makes the community stronger, rather than just more expensive." Morrison was quiet for a long moment, studying the materials they'd provided. His assistants exchanged glances that Lily couldn't read, and she felt her heart sink as the silence stretched. "It's ambitious," Morrison said finally, "and unconventional. The best projects usually are," Alexander replied calmly, though Lily could see the tension in his shoulders. The environmental impact mitigation alone would add months to the timeline, Morrison's development head pointed out, and the community engagement process you're proposing would require stakeholder management, that goes far beyond typical public hearings. True, Lily acknowledged. But those same stakeholders become invested partners rather than opposition. The additional time on the front end saves years of potential legal challenges and community resistance. Morrison leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. You know, when you first pitched this project 18 months ago, Alexander, it was solid, profitable, efficient, low risk, everything a developer wants in a commercial project. Lily felt her heart sink further, but Alexander's expression remained steady. This new proposal, Morrison continued, is something else entirely. It's the kind of project that could redefine how we think about urban development. It's also the kind of project that could fail spectacularly if we get it wrong. Yes, Alexander said simply. It could. Morrison smiled for the first time since they'd entered the room. I like it. Let's move forward with Phase 1 development and see how the community responds. The relief that flooded through Lily was so intense, she had to grip the edge of the table to keep from visibly sagging. Alexander's expression remained controlled, but she could see the satisfaction in his eyes, not just at landing the deal, but at proving that doing the right thing could also be good business. The next hour was spent on logistics and timelines, but Lily found it hard to focus on the details. They'd done it. Not only had they saved the Morrison project, they'd transformed it into something meaningful. As they shook hands and prepared to leave, Morrison pulled Alexander aside. That's quite a partner you found, he said, glancing toward Lily. Smart, passionate, completely different perspective from the usual development consultants. Where did you find her? Alexander looked across the room at Lily, who was gathering their presentation materials with the efficient movements of someone who'd learned not to take success for granted. When she looked up and caught his eye, her smile was radiant with accomplishment and relief. She found me, Alexander said quietly. The celebration lunch they'd planned turned into a quiet dinner at a small Italian restaurant near Alexander's apartment. The adrenaline of the presentation had faded, leaving them both processing what the day's success meant for their partnership and their future. I can't believe we actually pulled it off, Lily said, twirling pasta around her fork, with hands that were still slightly shaky from excitement. You were brilliant in there, Alexander said, his voice carrying a warmth that made her look up from her plate. The way you talked about community impact, about building something that lasts. Morrison was completely sold. We were brilliant, Lily corrected. This was never going to work without both of us. The words hung between them, carrying implications that neither had spoken aloud, but both understood. Over the past weeks, their professional partnership had evolved into something deeper, something that made the success they had achieved feel incomplete, without acknowledging what was growing between them, personally. Lily, Alexander began, then stopped, seeming to struggle with words that didn't come naturally to someone who'd spent years avoiding emotional complexity. I know, she said softly, saving him from the difficulty of articulation. I feel it too. The simple acknowledgement of their mutual attraction should have been a relief, but instead it brought with it all the complications they'd been carefully avoiding. The differences in their backgrounds, their financial situations, the power dynamics that their professional relationship had created. All of it suddenly felt overwhelming. This complicates things, Alexander said, stating the obvious because sometimes the obvious needed to be stated. Everything worthwhile is complicated, Lily replied, echoing something he'd said to her weeks earlier in a different context. Before Alexander could respond, his phone rang with the distinctive tone he used for family calls. He glanced at the screen, and his expression darkened. My uncle, he said apologetically. I should take this. Lily watched his face as he answered, seeing the subtle shift in his posture, the way his expression closed off. She couldn't hear the other side of the conversation, but she could tell from Alexander's increasingly tense responses that it wasn't going well. No, I understand your concerns, Alexander was saying, but the Morrison project represents exactly the kind of forward-thinking development that... He fell silent, listening to whatever his uncle was saying. Tomorrow? That's not really... Yes, I understand. Tomorrow. When he hung up, his face was pale. What is it? Lily asked, though she suspected she already knew. He's heard about the Morrison deal, about the changes we made to the original proposal. He wants to meet tomorrow to discuss what he calls my recent decisions. Alexander's voice was flat, but Lily could see the conflict behind his eyes. That doesn't sound good. It's not. Alexander set down his wineglass with unnecessary precision. My uncle isn't just family. He's also my primary investor. Without his backing, Reed Development doesn't exist, and he's made it very clear over the years that he expects my business decisions to prioritize profit over sentiment. The word sentiment carried particular weight, and Lily realized that their entire partnership, both professional and personal, fell squarely into the category of things Alexander's uncle would consider dangerous sentiment. "What are you going to tell him?" she asked quietly. Alexander looked at her across the table. This woman who'd changed his perspective on everything, from business to life in the space of 6 weeks. The woman who'd challenged him to be better than he'd thought possible, who'd helped him rediscover parts of himself he'd thought were lost forever. "I don't know," he said honestly. "But whatever I tell him, it's going to change everything." That night, they said goodnight at their respective bedroom doors with unusual formality, both understanding that tomorrow would determine not just the future of their business partnership, but whether the connection they'd discovered had any chance of surviving in the real world. Lily lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying the conversation with Morrison and trying not to think about what Alexander's uncle might say to convince him that success and sentiment were mutually exclusive. She'd seen how Alexander responded to authority, how the voice of his childhood could still override his adult instincts. The man who'd been brave enough to completely reimagine the Morrison project might not be brave enough to stand up to the person who'd shaped his entire approach to life and business. Down the hall, Alexander was having similar thoughts, weighing the certainty of his uncle's approval against the uncertain but infinitely more meaningful path that Lily represented. By morning he would have to choose between the security of his old life and the possibility of something entirely new. The choice would define not just his future, but the kind of man he wanted to be. As dawn broke over the city, both of them knew that their careful month of partnership, professional and personal, had led to this moment of truth. Everything they'd built together hung in the balance, waiting for Alexander to decide whether he was ready to risk everything for the chance at something real.